This is about science and the European Union, and about how the UK cooperates in science. Let me just get this going just quickly. This is us, Scientists for Britain. We're a campaign group which tries to lay out some of the basic principles about how we cooperate with the EU in science, to make clear that it isn't dependent upon political membership of the political club. The reason we're quite confident, or more than confident, in being able to say that is that the network of science and universities and participating countries in EU science includes 15 countries that are outside of the EU. Just to show you who they are. This is the map. Norway, Georgia, Turkey, Tunisia. Tunisia and Georgia joined in the last 3 weeks. They're part of the European Research Area. And this map, for me and for everyone I speak to, is proof really that you don't have to be in the EU political club in order to participate in science. The reason why that's important is that the UK is an active participant at the moment in EU science. That means that we get just under £1 billion of funding per year from the EU science networks. But non-EU countries receive a very healthy payment as well. And I'll just go on to the next slide here. This shows you some of the non-EU countries that participate. And this is the legal basis on which they participate. And it says here, the association agreement. They're called associated countries. And they operate on the same basis as EU member states. Now, the reason why we exist as an organisation, Scientists for Britain, as a campaign group we set up earlier this year, was to let people know that the scare stories that are out there about losing science funding and losing collaboration and losing expertise from around the EU is unfounded, because the logic tells us and the treaties tell us that there are non-EU countries taking part, and they take part with equal influence, funding, collaboration, and even movement of scientists is not impeded in the slightest. There is some talk about how well the non-EU countries do in scientific collaboration. And this will illustrate it for you. They do exceptionally well. You probably can't see it there, but these 3 countries, Iceland, Norway and Switzerland, they're all non-EU, and they are the highest participant countries in terms of involvement per capita in the Horizon 2020 programme, which is the science funding programme of the European Union. The reason they do so well is that they're sophisticated scientific countries, just like the UK, just like France and Germany. And what you get out of the EU is, in terms of that funding, is proportionate to, number one, what you put in terms of funding, and all of those countries, Iceland, Switzerland, Norway, contribute. And it also depends upon the scientific resource that you bring, because all of these countries have fantastic scientific teams, just like the UK does. It has scientific resources which it brings to the table, and that, in a sense, is where the balance comes from. That's what gives us the chance to apply for funds and to win backing. But you might have seen, has anybody here seen in the newspapers any stories about EU science funding, and how perhaps there are some scare stories out there about how it would all be lost if we were to leave the EU? Has anyone seen that? Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point about, besides having explained how the science funding wouldn't be lost, and how non-EU countries do exceptionally well, there is the fact that the EU funding that is received in the UK from EU science networks is only 3% of our total budget for science. You'd think, having read the newspapers, that it was something like 50%. And when I go to speak to people and ask them what proportion they think EU science funding is of the total research budget for the UK, most people tend to estimate it at around 20 to 40%. In actual fact, you see it here, it's 3%. So that's FP7 funding, which is the predecessor to Horizon 2020, which is the current funding stream. It's a higher proportion of university science, it's about 10%, but when you look at the whole of the research picture for the UK, it's actually quite small. When you consider that out of that 3%, 2/3 of that sum comes directly from the UK's science contribution to the European Union, and our membership bill is itemised in that way, then in actual fact, what we really receive from the EU as a value added from the EU in recognition of the scientific excellence of the UK is actually about 1% of our total research spending. So it's relatively small figures. We can't ignore it, it's significant. You know, for a lot of projects, it's make or break, but it's only 1%. And 1% add-on, but 3% total. Is anyone surprised by that? Does anyone think that that's probably less than you would have thought? Yeah. The other thing to mention about the EU and our scientific collaboration with the European Union and the EU Science Network is that it doesn't encompass all of the European scientific projects that exist. Some of the best and most successful ones are outside of EU funding, and here's some of them. The European Space Agency, CERN, EUMETSAT, European Synchrotron Radiation Facility, European Southern Observatory in South Africa, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. These have been going for many years and have fantastic outputs in scientific success. All of them are outside of the European Union's scientific structures. They're largely outside of EU funding, although they're able in some senses to gain funding for some of their subgroups, but they're essentially funded on an international basis and not a supranational basis. And this is the difference. It's the difference between EU and non-EU, because the way that the EU operates in science is to get us all together, pool funds, and give us and give out a certain amount based on what they regard as relevant. But in these international projects, there is a specified amount of input from the contributing countries and a specified amount of output that each of those countries receive. And it's been very successful. And that's the way that our cooperation with the EU would continue outside of the EU, because we'd be paying in and getting back, like Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, Georgia, Tunisia, and all the others. There's 15 of them. That's more than a third of all the participating countries in EU science. I hesitate to say EU science, it's led by the EU, but it's actually European science. For that very reason, because they're not all European Union countries. Now, people say, why are you so keen to leave the European Union if you're using these scientific arguments, if it just means no change? There's a really stark and strong reason as to why we must leave for the benefit of science, and that's because the regulatory imposition that's placed on us by the European Union. They come up with directives on a regular basis, and the problem with them is there is a certain zealousness to European Union regulation where they feel the need to come up with something to assert themselves. That's one problem, but the biggest problem is that they are so heavily influenced by lobby groups. There is an example for you, which is in this next page. This is a little tract which I'll explain in a second, but it's all about the Clinical Trials Directive, which was a law made up by the European Union under massive pressure from lobby groups, big pharmaceutical companies that have one objective, which is to capture regulation for their own ends. They want to influence the decision makers, orchestrate law in such a way that it's going to be beneficial to their business, and they've been very good at it. Big pharma companies have got more than 150 lobbyists in Brussels alone, and they spend €4 million a year just influencing the European Commission, European members of Parliament, and decision making and new rules. And they've been good at it, unfortunately, but the downside for us as a scientific nation is that it really hits hard small, innovative, scientific teams, because the big pharma companies want to put them out of the picture. And they do things such as, they create rules such as, I'm going to go through three of the principal ones, but one that I heard of just a few weeks ago was in pollution levels in laboratories. The European Union came up with a rule that said pollution controls need to be 3 times higher than they previously were. And so you've got a small innovative cancer laboratory in southwest London at Tooting, St George's Hospital, for instance, which had to close down its cancer trials, its cancer research, because it would have had to have spent £27 million on new filtration systems for its laboratories and all its people walking around in spacesuits for an unnecessary increase in standards of pollution control. That's a big problem, because what it's done, that and other rules, it's destroyed the clinical trials industry in the UK. The UK used to produce 12% of the world's clinical trials, and after the Clinical Trials Directive from the EU, that's now gone down to 1%, and it hasn't recovered, even though the Clinical Trials Directive, after an uproar from scientists, not just in the UK but across Europe, was subsequently amended, and it's not as bad, but the damage was done. Another difficult and problematic directive from the EU, again under pressure from the big lobbyists, was the Accidental Release Directive, which had a big impact on the British biotech industry. You might remember the days when people talked about biotech as the next big thing for British industry. Well, British biotech has been absolutely hamstrung by that single directive, and it's because it hits biotech directly because they're unable to go into agricultural trials and set up experiments with biotech. And again, agricultural biotech hasn't recovered, and that directive is still on the statute books in Brussels. A third one is the tobacco directives, which has been a disaster for public health, and health has obvious overlaps with scientific research. That has put a limit on the amount on vaping. You might have heard of vaping, but the Tobacco Products Directive makes it very difficult for vaping to exist. And so when the public health authorities are trying to get people off smoking and cigarettes, they use vaping as a very powerful tool to get people to drop cigarettes, but they're going to be unable to do it because of this directive that just is coming in, I think this week or last week. There's a constant churn of new rules, and there's something like 3,400 rules and directives have come in from Brussels, and not a single one of them has been overturned. The Clinical Trials Directive has been dampened down and made less damaging, but the damage is done. There are new rules around the corner. There's the Data Directive, which directly affects science, because in science, access to data is so important. If suddenly barriers have been in place, such as the EU's Data Directive, it's going to be far more difficult for scientific teams to share information, and it's become more difficult for them, and they're currently complaining about that. But what's going to happen? What we found in the past is that when scientists try to complain about the level of regulation that comes from the EU, they have a very small voice compared to the lobbyists that exist in Brussels with this massive spending power, and they don't get heard. I'll tell you one more interesting fact about lobbying in Brussels, particularly around science. Big pharmaceutical companies met members of the Juncker Commission 50 times, more than 50 times, in the first 4.5 months that commission was in power. And that was between about November 2014 to about April 2015 last year. It's as recent as that. And so that's a meeting every other day. And there's big money going into this. There's a massive drive by these big pharmaceuticals to capture Brussels. This is why they want to stay in the EU, these big pharma companies, not because it's going to help their business, but because they're going to be able to capture the regulation in Brussels in a way that they're not allowed to do in the UK, because they can't make that kind of lobbying approach in Parliament. They can't buy their way into regulation, and they can't sidle up alongside the MHRA, which is the UK's medical regulator, in the way that they can do in the EU. So, I've talked about some of the issues here around science, and what you will read in the newspapers from many scientists, including the people who signed this letter here. Where is it? A letter to the Times a few months ago from distinguished people: Stephen Hawking, Lord Ludlow, Lord Rees, these Sir Paul Nurse, who is the former head of the Royal Society. Distinguished people who politically like the idea of a unified Europe. Okay, but what they don't seem to realise is how injurious it has been for the UK and for science and for democracy and everything else. In about a week or so's time, Scientists for Britain are going to be taking part in a kind of a landmark debate where one of our people is going to be going up against Stephen Hawking. And his contribution is going to be pre-recorded from California. But we're going to be going through this letter with him because he's a signatory. And he's somewhere on the top there. There we go, Stephen Hawking. And we're going to dissect this letter, if you like, and tell him what we think was wrong with it, and tell him some of the difficult and really harmful parts of EU legislation, and ask him what he thinks of it, and ask him why he supports us continuing to be in this political project which has caused so many problems. Let me just go through some of the assumptions that they made in this letter, which were just unbecoming of senior scientists. First of all, they say, they talk about spending and collaboration. I think we spoke about that earlier on. Spending and collaboration would continue with the UK as an associated country, one of the 50, well, there are 15 at the moment, UK would be number 16. When we raise that with them in debates, they say, oh, well, you can't guarantee that the UK is going to be a part of that it's going to be accepted as an associated member. Well, it's so ludicrous to suggest that the UK wouldn't be accepted, because every single country that has applied has been accepted. And the European Union currently puts more funds into the UK for the benefit of Europe-wide science than any other country in Europe. So for them to want to lose the expertise that the UK brings is unthinkable and makes no sense. I'm jumping around a bit, I'm led a bit by the photos because they illustrate the picture for you. So Andre Geim came to the UK from Russia, a brilliant physicist, and he and another Russian emigre worked on the discovery of graphene, and he won the Nobel Prize for it in 2010. And he's based, I think it's in Manchester University. He's very discerning about the European Union and realises how, in many respects, it doesn't work. And you can see it here. I can offer no nice words for the EU framework programmes, that's the scientific funding programmes, which incidentally we'd still be a part of, which, except for the European Research Council, can be praised only by Europhobes for discrediting the whole idea of an effectively working Europe. So that's senior scientists. And in our group, Scientists for Britain, we've got about 7 professors, about 30 PhDs, And they're all trying to get this point across that actually we don't need to be a part of the political club in order to cooperate in science. So I'll come back to this. Some of the other topics that were raised, they mentioned Switzerland as being an example of a country that changed its relationship with the EU and then subsequently found itself outside of EU funding. That wouldn't apply to the UK because it's a different precedent, because Switzerland scrapped treaty arrangements that it had with the EU, whereas the UK would simply be acting under EU treaty to withdraw, which is Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which permits EU members to withdraw. We wouldn't be scrapping anything, we wouldn't be changing anything unilaterally that depends on bilateral relationships. So again, senior scientists here, unfortunately, making mistakes about the way that EU science works. And just to illustrate some of the mistakes that are made around this subject, we hear some of the pro-EU science people talking about how the UK would be shut out of the patent club and how beneficial this is the diagram here about the map of countries that participate in the European Patent Office. The European Patent Office is one of those many organisations that is completely separate from EU structures. It was set up in 1977 with no input at all from the European Union or European communities, and would continue to operate. We continue to be a part of it, and just as we would with so many of those other scientific networks, and even with the EU's Horizon 2020 European Research Area. That gives a bit of an overview. Very happy to take questions if you're not sure about anything I've said, or if you have any lingering doubts. Yeah, go ahead.
So you are talking for to vote to leave Europe, be free from them.
Yes.
That's what you mean.
Yes, yeah.
I understand, though I am not understanding everything, every aspect of this issue. I think for the migrants themselves, the people of all over Europe, for their safety as well, it is better to keep some boundaries in between, because now always people wandering all over Europe. One day we think, okay, it is better to be at Germany, we will be save more money there. Otherwise we will think, okay, Paris, we go Paris, or go to UK. So we are just wandering place to place. So we have to love our country wherever we are. Not only wherever we are, we have to stay and make progress there. We have to settle there and improve there. And if you get a better job or opportunity, move there legally with a proper correspondence, with the papers, go to the other place. It's like neighbors. We are staying in separate houses, neighbors. But there is always lock in each house. So if we are open, okay, you can come at any time in my house, I will come any time in your house. So everybody will face problem. We are affecting safety, so many issues coming. So it is like that. Each and every country should develop. There is no doubt about it. Everybody should be protected. Everybody's life is valuable. Everybody needs progress. So for that, I think we have to stay and settle each and every places, and we have to move legally, and we have to move with a legitimate purpose, with a job offer. Something is necessary. This problem I am seeing on the basis of how people suffer, how they suffer. That's what I feel. Thousands and thousands, people die. They bribe people to go to one country to another country, and going in boat, and the organizers themselves ground the boat, people dying. So please see that aspect and concentrate that for their welfare. We can, you are telling 350 million pound we are transferring to you Brussels for every week. So which is good, not bad. We have money, okay. We'll do something welfare for them directly. So suppose people from underestimated, very poor people travel from one place to another place. So let them start some business or enterprises there.
Yeah.
We can help them. They can establish there. So please. First thing I am coming. So then they can progress. So this just is giving money to run the parliament. It is meaningless. That's what I feel. The question is, so it is. I think I am talking some valuable point. That's why I am talking. So the question is, then the situation is like this. It is not helping anybody. Giving money. This is just becoming one. Nobody values. People die. So the question is, why the Prime Minister and all think that it is better to be with the European? I don't understand.
Yeah, thanks very much. They're really valid points and really relevant. And this is one of about 20 talks about the European Union, which you'll be hearing from us here. But there is a valid point about borders, different nations and cross-border collaboration in science, which touches on what you were talking about there, which is that when the UK signed up to the Maastricht Treaty and the Single Europe Act and all of that stuff in the 80s and 90s, the UK was signed up to free movement of people, which means that anyone in Europe, in the EU, can come and work in the UK. Universities and academic teams like the idea that they have access to scientists from all around Europe, and well, I'm trying to differentiate between Europe and the EU, you understand. But what we'd say to them is that those expert scientists will still be available to them, just as they're able to recruit people from outside of the EU at present. And when you look at the numbers, it's almost as many people come to the UK from outside the EU that come from within the EU, which demonstrates very clearly that visa requirements are perfectly tolerable for scientific teams in the UK, and that they can sponsor the best and the brightest people from all around the world. And freedom of movement is kind of a side issue. It reduces the number of forms they have to fill in, but in actual fact, they'll still be able to recruit people in exactly the same way. So yeah, it's a good point. And it doesn't. The points that you're making, they're so important because they're about human tragedies and about people who are trying to cross waters in order to find a safer place. And it's a problem for the EU. It's a problem that in many respects has been created by the EU, but needs to be tackled by somebody, anyone. At the moment it's being tackled by NATO and the military forces from around the world, North America, US, under NATO. But unfortunately it's not something that I can directly address as part of the science talk, but I agree. I wonder why on earth Mr. Cameron is speaking in such a way about trying to seek a solution from an organisation that's created the problems in the first place. Anybody else questions about science? I can recap in about half a minute for anyone who didn't catch all of it. The UK cooperates closely with EU scientific teams in many respects. The UK is one of the biggest collaborators, if you like, with other scientific teams around the world. Something like Actually, I've got a list of it here. I'll just whistle through my notes, which will give you an example of. This is a pie chart of. What's it called? Oh, hang on, sorry. This is a chart that shows you where the UK does its scientific collaboration around the world. 47% is within the UK. The UK scientific teams cooperate more with other UK teams than any other EU country. But the biggest, where are we? Multiple countries are the biggest, but the biggest single country that we do collaboration with is the US. And the US-UK scientific bridge, if you like, is the most productive for scientific papers anywhere in the world. It's been historically the most productive, and it still is. Now, that isn't an argument to withdraw from the EU, because the collaboration that UK scientific teams enjoy with other EU countries is significant, as you see, it's 7%, just under the number that we do with the US. But we can withdraw from the European Union and still be part of the European Research Area and Horizon 2020 funding, because so many non-EU countries, as you see in that map, are part of that group. Sorry.
I just wanted to point out that, having previously worked for the British Medical Journal, that medical research is a particularly bad example to use because of the way that medical research papers and journals are so skewed towards already existing US dominance. So the fact that we work mostly with North America isn't surprising in the slightest, because North America has more papers and more journals being produced anyway. So it doesn't really make sense to say that's a negative. We lose out, we not lose out by not being part of the EU. We would lose out by not being part of those existing papers. So I think that's particularly bad example.
Okay. What you find in other areas of science is that it's not too dissimilar. You're quite right, but when you look at science in general, not just in medical research, but every strand of science, UK-US collaboration is still the most productive, and that's scientific papers full stop. I'm not clear about what you meant about losing collaboration with the EU.
Would we not lose collaboration with the European Union? It would be more difficult.
Thanks. No, it wouldn't. I'm very happy to explain that. The way it works is that you will have seen in the newspapers lots of scare stories about how people think that we would lose access and we would lose funding and collaboration. We wouldn't, for one reason, that more than a third of the countries that are in that network, the European Research Area, are non-EU. And every single country that's applied to be a member of it has joined it. And this is the list of countries that are involved. These are all the non-EU countries. So there's 15 there. Once the UK left the EU, one of the aspects of it wouldn't even be an EU negotiation, it would be done separately with the European Research Area, but we'd put in a letter to say we're transitioning our membership and our involvement from EU member state to what they call associated country, and these are the associated countries. So we become a number 16. Sorry? Well, they pay in, it's negotiated, and what they pay in is often exceeded by what they get back. And so this is an example. You might not be able to see it from there, but the three lines on the left-hand side of the graph are Iceland, Norway and Switzerland. They're all non-EU countries, and they all, and this is a graph of participation in EU-funded projects, so per capita, because they're not a big country. Norway's got a population of 5 million, I think, Switzerland 8 million, but they are some of the most powerful scientific countries in the EU. the EU recognises that, the European Research Area recognises that, as it does with the UK. So all of those countries, those three countries on the left, get more funds back than they put in from the European Union, as the UK does as well. And the way that that is decided is not. They don't say, well, look, we'll give you €1 and you give us €1.5 back. It's kind of, it's not as organised as that. The funding is decided according to how many applications for funds that they put in and how many teams they have applying for funding. And in that respect, they operate on exactly the same basis as the UK. So the UK is one of the biggest applicants of funds. Something like 1 in 14 applications for funding from the UK is successful, and that is what makes us the biggest funded country in EU science. And that wouldn't be lost. That would be exactly the same. And what we found is that the pro-EU argument that you've probably heard on TV, you've seen in the Nature magazine. I've had blazing rows with them over the phone because they just do not get it. They don't see the basics because they're keen on the idea of the EU. They decided long ago that the EU equals good science. When the network itself, great, we need collaboration just as we need international collaboration. And the idea of EU science is a good one. But it doesn't need the political underpinning, and we don't need to be a member, and we can be an associated country. Now, it would be useful just to point to this graph, because that bit there is the amount of money. This is total UK research funding, and that sliver there is the 3% that the UK received from FP7 funding, which was the predecessor to Horizon 2020. 3% is a lot less than you might think that the UK receives from EU science. When I go to debates and lectures, people normally think that it's between about 20 and 30%. If you were to look at the value add, when I talk about UK giving a certain amount and then getting a bit more back because of the strength of its universities, 5 UK universities are in the top 20 and no other EU universities are in the top 20. Where the EU recognises the resources and expertise that the UK is bringing to the table, in all of those individual applications for funds, it says, yes please, you can have that funding, you can go away and do that project. And that's how those funds are won. But where they give more to us back, they give us about 50% more than we give to them under specifically the science tranche of our funding to the EU. And what that means is that 3% of EU funding actually translates into about 1% of total value add that the EU gives us, which is great. We're not going to be losing it. We're not going to be saying we don't want it because we're still going to be a part of this and still going to operate in the same way. But the relevance of that number is just to give context to people about the actually very small number, proportion of funding that we get from the EU. So when we read all the headlines, Stephen Hawking and all the others, Lord Ludlow, Lord Rees, the head of the Royal Observatory, Sir Paul Nurse, signing these letters here, which we helpfully marked for them. We gave them 0 out of 5 for all of the assertions they made that were all incorrect. The problem is that when they make those statements about how important the EU is to UK research, actually 3%. So we're still going to be a part of it, we still value it, and collaboration is essential. But we collaborate with teams all around the world, and we're still going to be a part of it. It doesn't need the political amalgamation that comes with the European Union. So I think hopefully that's answered questions. I'm not sure. But most people find this startling. I was last week. I was invited to something at the Royal Society, where there were some of these very eminent people that are quoted in this letter were talking, and they were surprised by some of the basics that we were presenting to them. And you think, hang on, some of these people listed here are scientific geniuses. When it comes to politics, we'd value the opportunity to show them a thing or two about how our scientific relationship with the EU will continue to operate.
Brilliant.
Thanks. Right. Any questions? I could talk all day.